All right, A-Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here, back for another video, and we are beginning a new period, Period 8, 1945 to 1980. Foreign policy is really all about the Cold War. All the events in some way during this time period relate to the Cold War, the fight for domination of the world between communism versus capitalism, between the Soviet Union, the USSR, and the United States. And we want to thank the Beatles for Back in the USSR, came out in 1968. Cold War, of course, begins in 1945 following the end of World War II. And the focus of this video is some foreign policy, but a lot of it is domestic policy in the United States, talking about some important laws and the growth of the suburbs. Also a little bit of foreign policy at the end of the video, dealing with the Cold War and the post-World War II plans for Europe. All right, before the foreign policy, let's talk about domestic policy and the post-World War II economy. And overall, the economy did boom dramatically from 1945 to 1970, despite some early struggles once the war was over. Overall, it was one of the strongest economies in American history. So a must know is the Taft-Hartley Act, 1947. Labor unions are a big part of A-Push, and this is really the beginning of the end of the power of labor unions. Taft-Hartley minimized the power of unions. It outlawed the closed shop, so now employers could hire non-union members. That's what an open shop is. Open shop means that anybody could be hired. Closed shop means the employer has to hire the union members. And so Congress outlawed this, which hurt the unions. Part of the reason for the decline of unions in the Taft-Hartley Act was the fear of communism after the Soviet Union rise to power. And so the second Red Scare begins in the late 1940s, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Also, Congress passes the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, otherwise known as the GI Bill. And for A-Push, the GI Bill is good enough to know. And this is an important law, and it really helped the veterans of World War II. And it made it easier for them to go to college, to get low-cost loans, and so really helped them. So massive government spending was made to help the soldiers coming back to get an education, to go to college, and help improve the economy and their lives. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the economy did boom following World War II. Maybe the late 1940s, it was a little bit of a struggle getting readjusted, but really it was a great boom, especially in the 1950s and the 60s. Part of the causes of the long economic boom were government spending for the Korean War, especially in defense. The arms race with the Soviet Union caused a lot of money to be put into defense, and also eventually NASA and the space race, which we'll talk about later. So that did improve the economy. Another huge cause of the economic boom of this time period was cheap energy, especially oil. And much of our oil was coming from the Middle East, and the United States did have a dominance of Middle Eastern oil. And we did have connections, especially in Iran. We helped put in the Shah, who was very friendly to the United States. In 1979, the leader of Iran, the Shah, is actually overthrown, which leads to the Iran hostage crisis in 1979. That will come later. And lastly, what industry fueled the economic boom? A big industry was the electronics. The electronics industry, the computer, the transistor, it really did start the more modern economy, especially with the use of electronics. All right, more domestic policy. Let's talk about the smiling Sun Belt, and that is the region in the South and the West. The 15-state region called the Sun Belt. Obviously, don't need to know the states, but the southern and western states, ranging from California all the way to Florida, were considered the Sun Belt. And what you need to know is post-World War II especially was a rapid increase in population. Okay, the cities started to boom after World War II, and of course today the populations are growing at a faster rate. Unfortunately, our beloved Michigan, we are not in the Sun Belt. We are, I guess they call it the Rust Belt, which I personally have a problem with. I think it's kind of derogatory, but I guess I'll get over it. All right, so the South and the Southwest was a new frontier for Americans after World War II. A lot of moving, a lot of population changes in demographics, partly because of jobs, and of course climate's always a big help for them, and lower taxes in the southern states. All right, more domestic policy. Let's talk about suburbia. Look at that. That's a Levittown right there. Hey, where's my house? I don't know. They all look the same. All right, so in the late 40s and 1950s, the economy did boom, and many white Americans were moving out to the suburbs. Okay, and partly it was encouraged by federal agencies to encourage housing. The VA helped the veterans find low-cost loans as well. And so there was a rush to the suburbs, and this is called white flight. Many whites were leaving the city and they moved out to the suburbs. And unfortunately, many of the cities decayed because of no economic growth. And so lack of resources caused that as well. And so there's definitely a segregation was beginning in the suburbs. And wasn't just the South, but also in the Northeast and Midwest, especially in cities like Detroit and Chicago. You started to see this white flight out of the cities, which caused them to struggle economically. Finally, Levitt towns, I think I might have mentioned in the beginning of this slide, named to no an A push. Levitt was a guy's name, and he built a bunch of homes in the suburbs, especially around New York City, and all the houses basically look the same. They're easy to make. You can make them cheaply, and it caused the boom of the suburbs, especially along the East Coast. The Levitt town was a symbol of white flight. All right, and the final economic domestic slide following World War II is the term baby boom, and I think many of you know what that is. Just the rapid growth of children after World War II from 1945 to 1960. These are the baby boomers. Incidentally, today the baby boomers are now in their 70s and 60s, so they're definitely using up their Social Security that they rightly deserve. But that's the baby boom, okay? Drastic growth rate in population. And as I mentioned, they are starting to use up Social Security. Because there's so many of them, Social Security is going to eventually start to run out, especially in the 2030 decade, I believe it is. But we still love these people. Love you, Mom. Fire up. All right, let's go away from domestic economic policy. Let's talk about politics a little bit. We're talking about the election of 1948 and Harry Truman. Of course, Truman takes over after the death of FDR in 1945. We know he was the man that made the final decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No college education, okay, but he was very considered a tough man, very strong, stubborn individual, very confident leader, and his famous saying is the buck stops here. And of course, we know that hockey goalies like to say the puck stops here. Okay, the last few slides are going to be about foreign policy. We're going to talk about the Yalta Conference, which interestingly enough happened before the end of World War II, February 1945, a few months before the end of World War II against the Europeans. Yalta is a city in the Soviet Union along the Black Sea in the Ukraine. So at the Yalta Conference, the big three meet: FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. There's a famous photograph of those three together, and FDR looks so old in that image, and he looks quite sickly, and that's about 2 or 3 months before he does pass away. But Yalta is probably the most important of the three conferences of World War II. We had Tehran in 1943, Potsdam in July of 45. Potsdam is actually after Yalta, and Potsdam was the ultimatum to the Japanese to surrender or be destroyed. Yalta is probably the most important one because it's about post-World War II agreements. And the first agreement between the big three was over Poland and some of the Eastern European countries. They're going to be allowed to have a representative government, or should have a representative government, and they're allowed to have free elections. Okay, so the people could decide who their leaders are. That was the agreement, but that never did quite happen. And after World War II, the Soviet Union really dominated them, hence the term Iron Curtain, which we'll get to later. Also at Yalta, besides the free elections for Eastern European countries, was the creation of the United Nations, and that was going to start in San Francisco later that year. The United Nations, the UN, which is still around today, and it was decided upon officially at the Yalta Conference. Word of the United Nations began, I guess the seed that planted it was the Atlantic Charter in 1941, a little bit of foreshadowing to the past. Stalin also agreed to attack Japan 3 months after Germany's fall, which is why on August 1st, the Soviets declared war on Japan 3 months after the fall of Germany. And then, of course, we know 6 days after that, on August 6th, Hiroshima, the city, was devastated by the atomic bomb. So a lot of things happen at the Yalta Conference. Hey, we got more Yalta. All right, so now, and also the Soviets received some islands for joining or declaring war 3 months after the fall of Europe on the Japanese. And a key thing the Soviets got was control over China's Manchurian railroads as well, which was a huge benefit for them for their resources. And a little bit of foreshadowing now, in 4 years, China will become a communist country, possibly because they were influenced by the Soviets, perhaps. All right, and so the Yalta Conference is important because did FDR give up too much? Did he betray the United States, or did he think it was a good bargain? Well, we know that Stalin does break his promise about free elections in Poland. It never happens, and he basically forms satellite nations in Eastern Europe, and so he kind of goes against his promises at Yalta. And so FDR, again, some people say he was too weak, and the Soviets really got way too much out of the Yalta Conference. But the most important thing long term was probably the creation and the beginning of the United Nations. All right, so this is really where the Cold War begins, following the end of World War II in 1945 between the two superpowers. I would highlight this term. Superpowers describes the United States and the Soviet Union. There really was no other countries that really were close in terms of economic and military power. A little bit of history between the U.S. and the Soviets. We know that FDR does recognize the Soviet Union in 1933, about 15 years after they became a country, after the fall of Tsar Nicholas II. So the United States did wait, which kind of annoyed the Soviets. And then also the United States and Britain delayed on the second front in Europe. We know that in 1942, the United States, where did we attack first? It was not in Europe, it was in North Africa, which annoyed the Soviets because they were getting destroyed by the Nazis in the Soviet Union. So they were mad about that because we waited until 1944 with the D-Day invasion. Also, we did not tell the Soviets about the development of nuclear weapons. We froze them out of that. Another annoyance of the Soviet Union. So tensions are definitely building before World War II is even finished. Wait, there's more problems. The United States also withdrew the Lend-Lease program from the Soviets in 1945, especially when we saw that we were going to win the war. We took aid away from the Soviets. Of course, we still gave it to the British. And so that's another thing the Soviets were upset with the United States as well. And we did not rebuild the Soviet Union like we did later in Western Europe with the Marshall Plan. We basically left the Soviets out to dry. Was it our responsibility to help them out? I don't know. But we did help out Western European countries. Of course, the reason why is because the Soviets were a communist country, definitely had a dictatorship as well with Stalin, but they were still annoyed with that. All this conflict increasingly leads to the Cold War. The Cold War, the war that never was. It was just the constant conflict and tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the fight between capitalism and communism around the world for 45 years. We never fight the Soviets, but we do fight communists in North Vietnam and also in North Korea and China. Okay, so let's finish up this slide. And so we talked about how the free elections never really happened in Poland. And Stalin wanted to protect the Soviet Union with a little bit of a buffer area, so he started to create spheres of influence. Okay, spheres of influence. It's not on this slide, but basically it was the Eastern European countries, Romania, Poland, East Germany. These countries will be dominated by the Soviet Union and they will become communist. Hence, that is why in 1946 Winston Churchill said an iron curtain has descended upon Eastern Europe. And so the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves in a political stare-down, like I mentioned, for the next 45 years with the threat of nuclear annihilation always in the back of their minds. It never happened, thankfully, but it was always a threat, and there were many flare-ups in several locations over this 45-year period. And we're going to begin with the next video. What region do you think is where the early Cold War really was the biggest conflict region? It was in Germany, and it dealt with the city of Berlin. And surprisingly, it has nothing to do with the wall. The wall doesn't come up until 1961. There's actually an event just as big as the Berlin Wall 13 years before that, 1948. We call that event in Berlin the Berlin Blockade and the Berlin Airlift.